Okay, folks, let's get going. We're going to start on the first parallel session, Religion and Welfare, 11 a.m. to 12:30. And supposedly already had one talk, but actually we're going to be on. So we're going to start out first with Doron, and it's going to be speaking about the religious origins of welfare policy.
Thank you. It has long been accepted by historians that Germany, preceded by England, was a forerunner of the modern welfare state established already during the 1880s. It is no less conventional that the foundation of such a state was a tactic applied by Bismarck, the German chancellor between 1871 to 1890, who was backed by the conservatives in order to confront the rising social democratic party. While this argument is by no means unfounded, it cannot offer sufficient explanation for the emergence of welfare policy in the German Empire of the late 19th century. In my paper today, I seek to demonstrate that no less significant a motive in applying this policy was the religious devotion, or rather Christian pietism, that was a dominant feature of German conservatism, namely the ideological home of Bismarck. In order to better understand the development of this religious social view, I will refer briefly to its early origins. Pietism emerged in late 17th century Protestant Europe in an attempt to reform German Protestant churches. A movement of religious renewal or awakening, it spread from Frankfurt through the work of Philipp Jakob Spener. During the 18th century, Pietism saw keen adherents, among them August Hermann Francke, and the establishment of its center in the city of Halle. Pietists emphasized the desire for an authentic experience of God's Spirit, for unlimited love for God and man, and for social justice and well-being. It was Herzensreligion, a religion of the heart. As a religious movement, Pietism was motivated by ideals of social justice. The widespread discontent in the 17th century German lands concerning the misconduct of political authority prompted Pietists to pursue a different authority, one which prioritized justice and social relief. Pietists condemned the materialism of absolutist royal courts, counterposing it to the more modest standards of the rest of society. They established cross-regional network of orphanages, schools, and nursing houses that meant to provide for the weaker elements of society. Pietism has experienced a renewal since 1815 after the Napoleonic Wars, which seemed to German supporters of the old system as an attempt to spread the secular and rational philosophy of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. At this point of time, however, a clear parallel was discernible between Christian awakening, the so-called neo-pietism, and the consolidation of political conservatism. Its social representatives were noble estate owners, members of the higher bureaucracy, part of the Protestant and Catholic clergy, and some intellectuals. In political terms, these conservatives clung to the idea of monarchical sovereignty in the grace of God, ruling through centralized administration and backed by the army. However, in social terms, their appeal was much more popular, trying to confront the growing difficulties of the lower classes during industrialization. Leading conservative theorists like Ludwig von Haller, Ludwig von Gerlach, Friedrich Julius Stahl, Joseph Maria von Radowitz, and still others believed that the hierarchical structure of society reflects God's creation. Haller, to take one example, argued that the state of nature reflects the natural order created by God and comprises social relations that are based on hierarchical interactions. Such social relations may be expressed in a man's authority over his wife and the right of a father to command his children. Hallel contended that where power and needs meet, dependent relations are created. This basic social structure could serve as the appropriate solution to the aggravating soziale Frage, the social question, a concept that depicted the growing distress of the working people in an economic system that turned industrial and capitalist. The Pietist conservatives' response to these changes, however, was not mere reactionary. Ludwig von Gerlach, the leading Pietist conservative in the mid-19th century, perceived industrialization as compatible with God's will, and as such, factories should be conducted according to Christianity's ideals of justice. The paternalistic system, which so far was exercised by noble estate owners towards their workers, should be applied now also in factories. The factory, in Gerlach's vision, would function similarly to a noble estate, where the workers would treat the factory owner as master. The owner would be required to secure the workers' material maintenance in cases of illness and old age, provide them with saving program, limits the work hours of women and children, and allow all employees to rest on Sundays. Throughout the 1850s and the 1860s, conservatives tried to introduce specific bills in these matters, which in fact handed over the religious paternalist commitments from the noble proprietors to the state. Since the 1880s, the initiative were taken by the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who, as I mentioned, struggled against social democrats who advocated strict social policy. The tactical meanings of Bismarck's welfare policy are very well discussed in the historical literature. My argument, in contrast, highlights the Pietist religious impetus which Bismarck shared with other conservatives. Looking carefully at Bismarck's pious belief, the picture that emerges is far more nuanced than mere political. Already in a letter he wrote to his wife, Johanna, in 1847, he confessed, "When I think about it, how 1 thaler could help a starving family, it looks to me like a theft from the poor, the hungry, and the freezing, if I spend 30 thalers for a trip." Later, his paternalistic stance appeared already when he added, "How far can I consider myself empowered to use what God has entrusted to my authority for my own pleasure, as long as there are people near to me who suffer from privation and frost, whose beds and clothes are lacking?" These are only few examples of Bismarck's understanding of the paternalist social responsibility conveyed by God to those people who won his grace. While until the early 19th century, such duties were of the aristocracy, then by the second half of the century, when the aristocratic ethos was eroded, the obligation of the able pietists toward those dependent on his support actually turned to be policy of the paternalist Christian state. Bismarck further expressed his Christian paternalistic state ideal in a series of statements during the 1880s. On April 2, 1881, while debating the first draft of the Accident Insurance Act, Bismarck addressed the German Reichstag while defining his welfare initiative as practical Christianity, praktisches Christentum. In a Reichstag discussion of January 1882 about legislation regarding work in factories, the Chancellor clarified that what he regarded as praktisches Christentum was the realization of the Christian ethic in the sense of brotherly love, Nächstenliebe. But the establishment of the welfare state inspired by Christian piety had additional dimension. When ideas about Christian compassion and support of the poor turned into official state policy, they went through secularization. Now, it was not merely almosen, namely charity, or Armenfürsorge, that is the traditional religious idea of poor relief, but a state program executed by rational bureaucratic apparatus. Insurance and other social payments by the state made the entire religious compassionate vocabulary into that of modern idioms, which featured concepts like risks, insecurities, entitlements, allowances, and compensation. And as Greg Higgins argued, this modern welfare policy appeared to secularize misfortune, placing it in the hands of employers, workers, professionals, and other regulations. At this stage, I would like to introduce, in brief, the development of welfare policy versus the religious secular dimension in 20th century Germany in order to get some more actual insights. With the collapse of the German Empire in 1918, Germany ceased to be an authoritarian state and became a republic, the Weimar Republic, in 1919, which lasted until the Nazi rise to power in 1933. During these 14 years, the main feature of the welfare state was subsidiarity. The Republic gave primacy to private engagement in providing services, and the result was that Weimar Germany was indeed applying welfare policy, but it was actually outsourced to private suppliers that were paid by the state. When welfare was identified with services from private profit-seeking agencies, the entire religious facet of state welfare policy was totally lost. Yet at the same time, the Republic's constitution introduced state neutrality in the field of religion. The practical outcome was that both the Catholic and the Protestant churches became independent and continued to pursue their own welfare activities. Since the late 1920s, Germany experienced a continuous debate over the future shortcomings of the welfare state. Historians considered these disagreements as crucial, since it was also a result of growing support for eugenicist view. Now, by the late Republic days, liberals and conservatives, as well as advocates of eugenics, regarded welfare policy as degenerating. This turn in the conceptualization of welfare policy anticipated the changes to come. When the Nazis seized power in 1933, they purged the social insurance system from undesirable personnel and directed the social support system towards racially and eugenically justified ends. The Nazis did not abandon welfare policy, but it was available only to those members of the Russian Volksgemeinschaft and stripped of any religious meaning. After the war, the welfare policy in West Germany was that of managed capitalism. Its emphasis was on promoting consumption in order to encourage economic activity and full employment. Thus, the policy of social support ceased to be a fixed rule, but only part of economic constellation that could not always secure welfare. During the 1960s and the 70s, the matter at stake was not welfare policy, but maintenance of standard of living. In recent years, public funding for what was originally welfare policy continued to decrease, and alternative support was sought for in the Catholic and Protestant churches as social agencies which care for those in need. Indeed, growing secularization brought about a decline in the church's revenue, yet churches appeared to offer support for local citizens as well as growing number of refugees regardless of their religiosity. In certain urban and regional communities, support by the church appeared much more available than that of social agencies administered by the state. Running kindergarten, home and nurse services for migrants and refugees, treatment of drugs addicts, all these services seemed more accessible and less bureaucratically involved processes than those arranged by the state. In this sense, and following my argument, in the current post-secular age in which the secular religious binary becomes blurred, religious agencies appear as much more committed and reliable in providing social support than what looks like the dwindling welfare state. Having said that, I must confess that I am a totally secular person and I'm not even a Christian, I'm only a Jew, so. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next we have Roger speaking about Ayahuasca, and Transnational Religious Poetics.
Thanks for having me here. As we track the motivations surrounding Ayahuasca's diaspora out of South America, we have the opportunity to confront indigenous erasure in its persistently Euro-Christian discursive forms, especially as the concept of healing provides both religious and secular discourse on ayahuasca and looks on the surface to be a site of contemporary mutual aid. While forward-thinking for his time, Peter Kropotkin's mutual aid remains mired in a Euro-Christian social and temporal frame, his analysis appropriately contests the fallacies of the social application of evolutionary theory by the likes of Thomas Malthus and the limited anthropology of Hobbes. He notes, quote, while some of Hobbes's 18th century followers endeavored to prove that at no epoch of its existence, not even in its most primitive condition, mankind lived in a state of perpetual warfare, citing Huxley as his example, he laments that, quote, Hobbesian philosophy has plenty of admirers still. Unfortunately, the ongoing genocide of indigenous peoples in the 21st century evidences the persistence of a kind of privileging of civilization narratives that impose what Mark Rifkin has called settler time. And beyond settler time, Rifkin writes, quote, U.S. settler colonialism produces its own temporal formation with its own particular ways of apprehending time and the state's policies, mappings and imperatives generate a frame of reference, such as plotting events with respect to their place in national history and seeing change in terms of American progress. Indigenous theorists have critiqued both the Marxian trajectories informing Kropotkin and the colonialist tendencies persistent in current forms of liberalism. In Red Skin, White Masks, for example, Glenshong Coulthard argues, quote, the politics of recognition in its contemporary liberal form promises to reproduce the very configurations of colonialist, racist, patriarchal state power that indigenous peoples' demands for recognition have historically sought to transcend. In his rejection of liberal multiculturalism, Coulthard advocates a rehabilitated notion of Marxist theory of primitive accumulation, whereby accumulation is not relegated to a particular period, but rather seen in the persistent role that unconcealed violent disposition continues to play. It's within Coulthard's attention to persistent violent disposition that I situate my own use of the term genocide against transcendent and event-based descriptions of the crime. Kropotkin argues in 1902 that mutual aid flows still even now, and it seeks its way to find out a new expression which would not be the state, nor the medieval city, nor the village community of the barbarians, nor the savage clan, but would proceed from all of them, and yet be superior to them in its wider and more deeply humane conceptions. Despite his good intentions and the critique of Christian imperialism, Kropotkin displays a Euro-Christian gaze on the indigenous peoples that persists in contemporary notions of mutual aid. Here I use the term Euro-Christian following Washhaje Osage, historian of native traditions, Tink Tinker, to designate a social movement rather than a religion. As Kropotkin's own sources display, colonizers largely regard religion as absent among indigenous peoples early on. David Chittister writes, quote, in the history of religions, the great divide between the natural, savage, or primitive religions and civil religions was the basic principle of classification. Tomoko Masuzawa argues that religion was endowed with all of the weight and moral cathexis that was once proper to liberal Protestant theology. this load of ideational energy has now been dislodged from that original site and transferred to religion itself, now that the very theology has run up against the wall of its own undeniable history. Brent Nongri notes, quote, "The idea of religion is not as natural or as universal as it is often assumed to be. Religion has a history. It was born out of a mix of Christian disputes about truth, European colonial exploits, and the formation of nation states. In particular, David Chittister details in Empire of Religion that Christian colonizers in Africa and the Americas initially described the native inhabitants as having no religion and only later come to recognize their practices as something like religion. The world religions model, which grew out of an ethnocentric notion of rationalism that assumed Christianity to be the most evolved religion, came to designate and locate the faiths from a pretension to Euro-Christian civilized space. Space became neutral, while justifying the displacement and removal of Amerindians as land became property. In contrast, Tink Tinker, among others, has repeatedly argued that Amerindians traditionally have no concept of religion. Whether overtly Catholic, Protestant, or expressed as natural religion, European conceptions of religion tend to be metaphorically hierarchical, and when we loosely apply the term, as frequently occurs in anthropological writing and museums, we inadvertently perpetuate a Euro-Christian frame persistent in Kropotkin and in need of critique as we consider mutual aid. As Eduardo Kohn has mentioned with respect to our being colonized by the ways that we think about relationality, quote, "We can only imagine the ways that in which selves and thoughts might form associations through our assumptions about the forms of associations that structure human language. And then, in ways that go unnoticed, we project these assumptions onto non-humans. Without realizing it, we attribute to non-humans properties that are our own, and then to compound this, we narcissistically ask them to provide us with corrective reflections of ourselves." Kohn's description reads nicely if we're describing Euro-Christian thought, and though he is writing this in order to understand how forests think, that's the name of his book relies heavily on linguistic analyses of Quechua and resounds with the inhumane treatment of Amerindians despite the Euro-Christian decision that they were indeed humans with so-called natural rights, which are not natural, but rather alienated through a conceptualizing Euro-Christian legalistic process. This reveals an underwritten Euro-Christian political theology in binaries between religion and the secular, as well as in debates about religious freedom. Therefore, I propose that in thinking of mutual aid in the 21st century, we consider Luis Leon's concept of religious poetics, wherein the making and achieving of religion itself buffers against colonial and state regimes of power, especially as we consider transnational impulses such as the diaspora of Ayahuasca outside of South America. It's well known that the U.S. Supreme Court's recognition of Ayahuasca religions has allowed for expansion in this diaspora, and that U.S. hegemony in South America inflects debates about Ayahuasca regulation there. Processes of legal recognition with respect to the First Amendment in the U.S. can be seen with the court's recognition of theologically Christian Ayahuasca religions such as the União do Vegetal or the UDV Church and Santo Daime churches in the, quote, exemption for the use of ayahuasca as a sacrament despite its containing of dimethyltryptamine or DMT. DMT is a Schedule I substance under the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which has been a legal tool for the prohibitionist rhetoric of the war on drugs, a cover for U.S. imperialism throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Tied to its Euro-Christian roots, the drug war is the current incarnation of Augustine's theory of just war, which has been repeatedly used in subjugating and genocidal policies toward Amerindians. Unlike socialists, anarchists have long fought against prohibitionist attitudes. As Susan Boyd writes, early anarchists such as Emma Goldman and Peter Kropotkin questioned moral reformers and advocates of prohibition. Goldman noted that how socialists advocated for prohibition in order to win votes, thus suggesting that prohibition has never been a question of critical thinkers versus conservative pundits. Even in debates among controlled substances surrounded by ideas of cognitive liberty, like Charlotte Walsh in England, Euro-Christian framing persists in static and transcendent notions of freedom. Contrasting at times and complementing this is an entire discourse on Amazonian shamanism rooted in universalized conceptions of religiosity and perpetuated by secular emphases on ayahuasca's healing potential and the domestication of psychedelic substances to biopolitical regimes of healthcare evidenced by the recent psychedelic renaissance. As scholars such as R. Andrew Chestnut have noted, the rapid spread of faith healing throughout South America during the 20th century was accompanied by liberalized secular states and complemented by charismatic forms of Catholicism in reaction to the influx of Protestantism. The rapid spread of Protestant and non-denominational missionary efforts to, quote, civilize Amazonian Indians cannot be separated from U.S. foreign policies of development in South America, fueled by Cold War and drug war rhetoric as contemporary Euro-Christian forms of just war. Contesting the assimilation of ayahuasca into persistent colonial frames requires critical attention to the deep cultural frames without regressing into archaic charges of essentialism. So Eduardo Viveros de Castro has advanced the term Amerindian perspectivism to account for persistent deep framing, despite more than 500 years of Euro-Christian colonization. Such terminology is necessary because most of these scholars are not Amerindian people, and because the discourse itself is caught up in the colonial romance of the disappeared Indian. Viveros de Castro says that perspectivism is a label for a set of ideas and practices found throughout indigenous America, and to which he refers, for simplicity's sake, as though it were a cosmology. This cosmology imagines a universe peopled by different types of subjective agencies, human as well as non-human, each endowed with the same generic type of soul that is the same set of cognitive, that has the same set of cognitive and volitional capacities. With respect to the U.S. Court's recognition of the UDV Church in 2006, Elizabeth Pavanelli writes, quote, at the moment that the Supreme Court upheld the Circuit Court of Appeals exemption for ayahuasca religion, the Drug Enforcement Agency was removing all references to the Native American Church in its regulatory guidelines and replacing it with references to members of federally recognized tribes. This change aligns with the enforcement of regulations of the DEA with actual language of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which does not recognize members of Native American Church, but recognizes Native Americans. So we have a decision that exempts members of UDV Church, a Christian theological ayahuasca religion, on the basis of an analogy with members to the Native American Church, even as the DEA is refusing to recognize the equality of rights among all members of the Native American Church. So I should stress again that the groups receiving religious exemptions are avowedly Christian in their theology, as is the Native American Church. Nevertheless, Pavanelli indicates that the general religious exemption for psychedelics, the psychedelic substance par excellence in the US, which is peyote, did not hold as the American Indian Religious Freedom Act moved toward the ethno-national definitions in legitimating indigeneity, which is a clear kind of politics of recognition. Outside of the argument for religiously exempt status for ayahuasca, a growing multitude of New Age rhetoric similarly capitalizes on universalizing references to indigenous practices while being steeped in Western liberalism's fixation on the experience of the individual, liberal subject in a rights-based tradition. Here the post-secular remains Euro-Christian. To make things even more complex, in 2016, the National Council of Native American Churches rejected attempts by groups claiming to be part of the Native American Church who use ayahuasca or other entheogens. So while the state's regulations require people to prove their indigenous status before the law on one front, those people constantly battle appropriative rhetorics of indigenous spiritualities and traditions employed by New Age seekers and fringe branches of the Native American Church on another front. At the same time, researchers of ayahuasca almost inevitably have to advocate for its beneficial properties against hegemonic discourse informed by drug war rhetoric. In closing, that discussions of mutual aid attempt more engagement with indigenous scholarship which generally works with a longer history in mind. There is nothing prior or primitive about the accumulation of capital in this thought. While Amerindians are often treated as archaic or extinct in both public and academic discourse, the interspecies regard of an Amerindian perspectivism points to ontologies necessary for addressing the environmental concerns that we're all facing. Rather than occupying a 0-degree, a liminal space between subject and object, conscious and unconscious, immanent and transcendent, perspectivism advances an interspecies recognition of personhood. Thank you.
Mutual aid is not a topic that I would have been interested initially, but I noticed in working on Abrahamic religions that mutual aid is an idea which comes out of Abrahamic religions. So that's what I want to talk about now. There are 2 points which I would like to get across. The first is, pagan classical Western culture had no notion of mutual aid. And the second is that from Moses to Jesus to Muhammad, you see an evolution in thinking about how mutual aid is to be transferred and handled. So these 2 points, let me get to the first one. You might think that the high-minded Greeks and the practical Romans knew a lot about mutual aid. They didn't care about it. Athenians didn't care about orphans, except those orphans whose fathers had died in warfare. Spartans did not care about babies that seemed weak. They would leave them to starve in the woods. You might say, well, maybe that was true in ancient Greece, but it wasn't true in ancient Rome. They had things like Annona. They had the cries for panem et circenses. Yes, they had the Annona, which was a free distribution of luncheon vouchers to everybody living in Rome. But they weren't handed out to people because they were poor. They were handed out because they were Roman plebeians, and there was a power struggle and a balance of power between patricians and plebeians. You didn't have to be poor to get your luncheon voucher by the Annona. You had to be a Roman plebeian. There's a difference. You might say, well, but they also had a lot of fun back in Rome. They offered panem et circenses, bread and games. Yes, but that was for the glorification of the emperor. You might say, well, but there was philanthropy in ancient Rome, wasn't there? There was the term of liberalitas. That's right. But liberalis and liber is not exactly the same thing. What you would do as an eminent Roman, you would do something which would show what a marvelous person you were, what a glamorous person you were. You would surround yourself with people and invite them to festivities. You might even endow wonderful buildings to show what your wonderful community is that you were living. But helping poor people simply because they were poor was never on the agenda. So that was the first point. Why did that change, and how did that come to change? Well, it came from, not out of Europe, it came from the Middle East, starting with Moses. Moses was not a standout economist. Nothing he did was unusual by standards of the time. He did everything that people did when they transfer from pastoral to sedentary societies, except for one thing. He was very good in picking up ideas from neighboring cultures and investing them with new meaning. One such was a Babylonian notion of Shabbatu, which was a system of debt relief which would be announced on the accession of a new king. Moses took the notion of Sabbath and said, well, there's a religious significance here, and we have this recurring notion of the Sabbath of 7 days, 7 years, and 7 times 7 years, and we are going to make this an ethical, we're going to give this a religious dimension. After 7 days, you rest. After 7 years, if you're a slave, you're set free. After 7 times 7 years, property reverts back to the original holder of the property. So it was a form of property and income equalization policy. His policy was, and the society he created was egalitarian, static. You had to be a very hard worker. But it still did not look after poor people simply because they were poor, but there were mechanisms for helping those people who were poor. I will mention one other. There are numerous references in the books, or several references in the books of Moses, into harvesting regulation. So if you harvested, you had first crack, you had the first harvest went to the tenant, but after that, poor people could go and they could start gleaning. That's where the word gleaning comes from. The book of Ruth is one such example. So here what you have with Moses is the beginning of help towards self-help, the beginnings of income equalization. Later on, as Israel developed, Moses about 1200 or somewhere between 1400 and 1200 BC. By the time you get to 1,000 years later, there's a notion of tzedakah, of synagogues doling out relief. And I'll revert to that later on. But right now, let's leave Moses and move on to the next important phase in Abrahamic religions, which begins with Jesus. Now, Jesus, the ministry of Jesus was very much shorter than that of Moses, and as we will see later on, of Muhammad. So there was far less, there was nothing in terms of economic policy making in Jesus. Jesus did distribute alms. We know that from there are several references in the New Testament, and there's the famous story of when in Bethany, a lady who is devoted to him pours ointment on his head, a very expensive luxury item, and the apostles are irritated. They say, why do you allow this? This could have been sold and handed out to the poor people. And Jesus said, no, yes, it could have been, but I will not be with you always, words to that effect. And so there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. Jesus did not believe in wealth equalization, did not practice wealth equalization, but he did hand out alms voluntarily. Things moved on after Jesus was no longer present under his successor Peter. The letter of Peter is one where you find the word oikonomia theou, economy of God, a term which I feel is perfectly appreciated in theological literature, less so in economic literature. The word oikonomia was used by Jesus, by Paul, and by Peter. But Peter was the manager. He took over from Jesus and he turned the community into an organization. And Peter is the one who in his letter writes about the divine, God's economy. And you may recall, if you've ever read the Acts of the Apostles, there's a term that everybody hears. They were of one heart and one soul. That's become an adage, people being one heart and one soul. Well, what exactly did that mean? Well, Peter made clear what that meant. It meant, for example, that he would sell property and the proceeds would be used for the poor. And there's the famous clash because somebody did that but didn't hand over all his money. Peter was very upset and he castigated this person, I think his name was Ananias, who then collapsed and died. And just to make sure just how bad that person was because he didn't hand over all his money, Sapphira, his by then widow, who then turned up and said, why has my husband died? And had the story explained to her. She collapsed too, and she died too. So just so you don't get in case you didn't get the point, if you sell something, if you sell a capital asset, you have to give all of it to the poor. So that was the oikonomia theou as Peter conceived it. By the end of the 2nd century, the Tertullian thinker in Carthage, in defense of Christian practices, which by then seemed very odd to the reigning Roman regime, spoke about deposita pietatis, deposits of piety, because the Christians by then not only had communal meals, as they had in Jerusalem, but they would also be giving out monies for people who were literally washed up, people that had been shipwrecked, or they would be giving out money and reserving it for ransoming people. By this time, too, of course, things had moved on with the Judaic community. Jews in Rome had about 12 synagogues already in the days of Peter and Paul, and those had their own welfare relief system, handing out what was called tzedakah. So you have a convergence here between Christian and Judaic practices. Which came first? Who influenced who? Were they independent? I have no cards to play on this. I have no idea. But what's important is that we see here a systematization and a regularization in what was, in the days of Jesus, a completely voluntary one-off act of handing alms into something which had a certain element of regularity. Pagans, by this time, had not yet disappeared. In the 4th century, the grandson, I think it was, of Constantine the Great, became emperor, and he wanted to do something to bring back the good old days. And Julian the Apostate was a very literate, highly cultured, and fascinating character. He recommended to pagan priests, one of the things we ought to do, we ought to copy Christians in giving out welfare relief. Because that's one of the reasons why people become Christians, and pagans don't do that. So this is something we've got to improve, we've got to do. As it happened, Julian didn't get that chance. He had a very short lifespan, so his life was cut short. So mutual aid could have come to paganism had Julian prevailed, but he didn't. But it was acknowledged even by someone as important as Julian, mutual aid is a Christian idea. We're now fast forwarding again by a few centuries to Mecca, moving to Mecca, to the prophet of Islam, Muhammad. Muhammad had, his biography falls in two phases. The first was in Mecca, the second was in Medina. In Mecca, he was head of a private community of private individuals. Things didn't work out between Muhammad and the powers to be in Mecca. So he had to say, it's my way or the highway. He chose the highway, went to Medina, and then he became the leader of a political community. There are two steps in the development of mutual aid which happened during the lifetime of Muhammad. The first was, in Mecca, his religion appealed especially to lower classes and to people and to slaves. And it appealed to them, and he introduced zakat. And I think I already mentioned tzedakah earlier on. He introduced zakat, which was a voluntary annual gift. Remember, Jesus gave alms, but he didn't do it every year, didn't do it regularly. Muhammad, who I feel is the first religious economist, Muhammad made this a regular voluntary, still voluntary, but a regular annual gift dedicated to the indigent. That, in this way, had not happened before, not with Jesus, and certainly not with Moses. We now come to the second phase of his life, when he's in Medina. Islam is now expanding. Muslims conquered regions, and after a very significant conquest, that of Khaybar, Muhammad gave out lieges to his chief companions, and one of them, Umar, said, "Thank you very much. This is I'm happy with it. What do I do with it? I don't need all this money." And Muhammad said, "Well, think about giving it to the poor." And what happened then was a key moment in the history not only of religion, but also of financial and legal thought. Because after that, there was created something that had never existed in mutual aid and philanthropy before, the Waqf, spelled W-A-Q-F. Some of you may not have heard of a Waqf, but think Islam, think trust, put it together, that's a Waqf. A Waqf is an endowment which is ring-fenced, which has legal standing, and which has three distinct parties. Firstly, the donor who irrevocably commits an endowment to the Waqf. It has the mutawali, the manager, who is independent of the donor and whose job is to make sure that the monies are spent as initially intended. And you have the third party, the beneficiary. If this sounds like trusts, that's exactly what it is. And trusts came to England exactly after the Crusades, after Franciscans and Knights Templar would have had an opportunity to see how the Waqf worked in the Middle East, in Islamic countries. So Muhammad did things that were completely new and completely innovative. He made mutual aid, which was a concept endowed idealistically by predecessor religions, but he also changed the way it was funded and financed, because previously zakat, tzedakah, alms were given out of your current income. A waqf was a self-standing capital asset base with a recurring income managed by an independent manager. And it was endowed it was not under control of priests, but as an independent, autonomous institution could be used and ramified for any number of philanthropic purposes. For example, in education, for example, in orphanages, for example, in hospitals. And our earliest colleges in Europe, our earliest hospitals are based on the models of madrasas and of Islamic institutions. So, ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to make 2 points, and I'll just go back over them again. The first is that the Greeks, all those people wearing togas and that we admire because they're so high-minded, they had no notion of mutual aid. They didn't care about the poor guy sleeping on the side of the road. The Middle East provided notions of mutual aid, which changed and evolved over time, from Moses, who lived around 1200 BC, to Muhammad around 600 AD. That's nearly 2,000 years. And it moved in Abrahamic religions from, to put it in a very simple way, from help to self-help, to help on a voluntary basis, to help on a recurring and communal responsibility. Thank you very much.
Great. Okay, next, Loren will talk about the mutual aid of dreams.
Thank you for including me on the panel. How might dreaming as a metaphor-making operation contribute to social coherence and mutual aid? Scholars such as Trigant Burrow, Roger Bastide, and Montague Ullman have long emphasized the necessity for a sociology of dreams. Yet how might such a sociology, or even society of dreaming, operate and be put into practice? Precedents may be found across divergent cultures, locations, and time periods, from the dream-based socialized medicine of the ancient Greek temples of Asclepius to the dream-directed social structure of the Senoi people of Malaysia, whose dream-sharing practices, according to Patricia Garfield in Creative Dreaming, not only govern the majority of their waking life behavior, but also eliminate totally neuroses and violence. The long-standing Korean phenomenon of taemon, or conception dreams, based on the belief that no child can be born without first being dreamt, as well as Robert Moss's examination of the Ashanti people of Ghana, who are said to hold each other accountable in waking life for criminal and amoral acts committed in dreams, may offer additional insights into the possibilities of constructing a dream-based mutual aid. As Angel Morgan, an avid practitioner of dream sharing and the current president of the International Association for the Study of Dreams, states, dream sharing helps cultivate sympathy, awareness, understanding, self-esteem, and a sense of community. So I wanted to try it myself, and here are some of the results. I began my dream sharing experiment by reaching out to a dream informant, hereafter B, who is not so much a friend as a senior colleague. A chance meeting in the hall produced the following exchange. Me, I am working on a paper about dreams. What I am doing is contacting people who appear in my dreams, sending them the dreams, and asking them to write their impressions and associations. I would like to ask you to participate as you appeared in my dream. B, oh, it's an honor. It strikes me that the sense of honor B expresses here arises not from being asked to participate in the project, but from having appeared in my dream, the honor of being encountered in dreaming life. As B did not yet know anything about the content of the dream, his sense of honor derives solely from the fact of having appeared in it. What would the world be like if we all regarded each other, apart from any narrative or agenda, with such pleasure, respect, civility, and excitement upon encountering each other in waking life? Experimental research often leads to unanticipated discoveries. Through this first approach, I have become more interested in another aspect of dreams, not just the social aspect, but more particularly what we might call the etiquette of dreams. At first glance, dreams, with all their force of id and lack of inhibitions, may seem, in contrast to our behaviors in the waking world, thankfully, if not gloriously, devoid of etiquette. This first encounter, however, leads me to suspect that there is a sacred formality in dreams, especially evident in their recording and recounting, which accounts for an elevated, often higher standard of decorum and social interaction than in the waking world. The formality of dreams arises from their mystery. During a dream that opens with a long bus journey over the highways of South Korea, B appears ahead of me in line at the rest stop men's room. As we move forward, I am appalled by the stench and dilapidated condition of the toilets. So this is the dream. I almost jump out of line, then realize I really have to go to the bathroom. I don't know how I'll be able to make the rest of the trip without relieving myself. Then I think, well, we're men here. B is okay with it. Just get in there, hold your nose, do your thing, get out of there, get back on the bus. I'm thinking I'll stand on the bench and squat over the wicker so no part of my body has to touch it. Still, it feels like one could contract any kind of infection or disease just from entering this space. Then I look back at B and notice he's having second thoughts. I can tell from his body language he doesn't want to go in. He's talking and texting on his smartphone, explaining the situation and looking for other alternatives. Thank goodness, now I feel more comfortable about doing the same. So after reading this, B responds, on a family trip, once I had to pull over at a highway rest area since one of my sons wanted to relieve himself out of the blue, but found the area was closed, so I got off the highway to find an unobtrusive spot for him. Found a police officer in a squad car there with a speed gun. Asked if he would kindly look the other way, and he said yes. He had many experiences of that kind when his kid was young. I felt so relieved myself. Culled from waking life experience, B's response argues for an interpenetration of dream and waking life. Its primary points of connection are a common setting, rest stop, and empathy or shared understanding, which transcend any dream-waking barrier. It also duplicates the social power relation, as B is relieved by an empathetic authority, the policeman with his speed gun. So I am relieved by B's empathetic authority. The duplications, however, do not end there, as I also correspond with his son. That's just how fast, through the power of dreams, one can go from non-friend to family. C, a borderline friend, business acquaintance, stands in stark contrast with his initial response. Why on earth you're dreaming of me, I have no idea. Keeping in mind the etiquette of dreams, such a response could be rather awkward in waking life. Imagine upon greeting a friend met by chance on the street being asked, why on earth are you meeting me here? Among other things, it raises the question of the degrees of control we have over who we meet in waking life as opposed to dreams. Lucid waking versus lucid dreaming. C appears in my dream as a divided or doubled self. C1 fires a blue flamethrower from the 5th floor veranda of a courtyard apartment at C2, who fires back from ground level with a hybrid assault sniper rifle. It's an intense battle, but C1 with the flamethrower has the firepower and the edge. C2 on the ground is hurting, but he'll never give up. Flames swirl around his body, but he seems okay. I realize C1 up high is just out of distance, so the flames only lick the body of his target. They can't quite burn him up. This is in the voice of a play-by-play commentator, a role C has played in waking life. The dream ends with flamethrower C1 being subdued by authorities in the courtyard. C responds as follows. I'm wondering why, if you are going to have a dream with me in it, am I with an assault rifle? LOL, I'm far less violent than I might seem. C's tone here reminds me of his initial response, and its phrasing is so peculiar. If you're going to have a dream with me in it, sounds like a kind of reprimand. You shouldn't be dreaming of me in the first place. But if you are going to dream of me, you should dream this way, not that way. Such guidance could reveal a desire for even more strict control over self-image in the dream world than the waking. Renewed by this dream, our correspondence is now flourishing. It has led to a deeper friendship in the form of literary collaboration, as C has offered to continue to participate in my project as long as I continue editing his short stories. An old college friend, D's initial response may indicate a side connection. Quote, I actually do want to do this dream thing. I thought your dream was super interesting and it caused you to have some very small incursions into my dreams, like flickers. I like this sense of subliminal influence. Such flickers may indicate that the mere suggestion of dream connectivity could lead to collateral presence. Though reciprocal, the term incursions also stands out for its connotation of an unwanted presence. This sense that I am intruding into or invading D's dream space could derive from the specific purpose of my dream journey to New York. I have a definite sense of where I'm going, guided by sound. The sound of D, professional, professorial looking, surrounded by underlings on the steps of his offices at Columbia University. I'm coming to surprise him, to play a joke. And what do you know, just at the moment he's saying something, I arrive on the steps below him in an old man's mask to abruptly finish what he is saying mid-sentence, sentence robbing. When I do so, there is a dramatic pause, and all heads turn my way, including D's. His face peels into an enormous Cheshire cat grin. D responds, we all get interrupted by an old man's mask mid-sentence, don't we? But it rarely turns out so lightheartedly. I recently realized that the grin without a cat is the reclining crescent moon. It has also occurred to me that the full moon, when in New York City, is Andy Warhol smiling down at us. My Columbia empire of underlings has crumbled. Actually, I'm just making this connection. Maybe I told you this over the phone. X now does my orientation speech, word for word. He reads the speech I wrote and delivered for the first 2 years, and I stand there and watch him. So this sentence robbing thing is real, though again, not so funny. Notice the lyrical qualities of D's associations. In addition to surrealist equations and classical illusions, Ozymandias, they are replete with both rhyme and alliteration. Invoking Spinoza and Montague Ullman on the interconnectedness of all being, along with the two most important premises of this project. One, that dreaming and waking life are not separate, but comprise a continuum. And two, that the dreamer is everyone who appears in the dream. I try to suggest how we might view even those who do us wrong in waking life as, if not ourselves, at least potential good friends. To this, D replies, the function of friends is to validate one's sense, construction, or dream of reality, and you certainly do that for me. E, a colleague in Korea, meets me in a claustrophobic, dangerous workplace dream space. About to make my escape, he introduces me to a recently installed computer program. There are some lines of codes and questions on the screen with spaces in between, such that it looks like a poem. In fact, it's a kind of puzzle. Even with my limited knowledge of math, science, and computers, with E's guidance and through immediate responsive intuition, I can see that the program is designed to produce associations from those who respond to it. Based on the previous lines of code, we have to type in new lines at the bottom. And based on what we type in, new lines appear and previous ones are subtly altered. Even though I don't know what I am doing, I try, and the feeling is a liberating one. Despite, or because of, the apparent antiquity and simplicity of the technology, I can see that the program has been designed in such a way that it can lead to solutions to problems, mathematical, scientific, religious, and social, that were previously thought unsolvable. This program opens up unlimited possibility. Even after just a few minutes of working with it, typing in a few lines and then a few more based on the lines that issue from the computer, I get a joyful rush of intense productivity and breakthrough. Nothing is quite certain or proven yet, but I am already making remarkable headway in 2 or 3 areas of research. The black screen and delay between when the keyboardist enters text and the responding text emerges produces an atmosphere of mystery and excitement, heightening the feeling of the oracular. While the program's dialogic function mirrors that of my project, its poetic and puzzle-like qualities evoke the poetic language and logic of dreams, as well as Freud's rebus method of interpretation. The ability to forge ahead under uncertain circumstances brings to mind negative capability. E, who recently completed a book on Freud's theory of dreams, responds. The general ambiance of the dream reminds me of Orwell's 1984. This is particularly so because I'm sure the dream is a depiction of our current working environment, which I associate strongly with Orwell's dystopia. The program brings to mind our common interest in dream interpretation. It relates to associations and the liberating effect that such could bring. It also brings to mind the paper-generating program that we've been playing with. The relations with maths and science may also have something to do with my own book, in which maths and science appear both as metaphor and as promise. The promise being that these disciplines could provide dream interpretation with the firm grounding it appears to lack. I think the overall theme of the dream is that of escaping from our oppressive environment, either from within, by finding an area of research that offers hope, or simply by running away. I hope this paper is an attempt to find that area of research that offers hope. Thank you.
Adrian, you're gonna stay on schedule?
We are going to, yeah, basically have 15.
So why don't I keep people from lunch?
Just under 20 minutes.
Okay, good deal. So, questions for Marcia?
Actually, I just had one or two comments in reflection and somewhat support to Benedikt Koehler's paper. The first one being that the debt relief from the surrounding Babylonian cultures and Canaanite cultures to some extent underwent a conceptual shift as it found its way into the First Testament and as those ideas developed, because that's, as you know, a moving story of its writing and those conceptual developments. And the shift was, as you said, the new monarch could always institute debt relief to recruit the loyalty of the population. The conceptual shift is that this has moved away from the debt relief in both the Shemitah and the Yovel Jubilee are moved away from the monarch and made an institutional and societal requirement as part of the mutual constitution of covenant with God and covenant among persons. And that's a very important abstraction of the principle away from, in some sense, the glory of the reigning power to this societal value structure. The second, I just said the second. The third, Julian also remarked that it was an embarrassment that Roman citizens had to beg when not only Christian but also the Hebrews had their substantial system of poor relief. And this leads me to wonder or to propose that help to the less fortunate because they were less fortunate was in fact institutional and societal in the 1,000 years of Hebrew Jewish development. That it was not merely individual and voluntarist, because harvest giving, leaving the corners of the field, and so on, the widow and the orphan, and so on, including debt relief, mandatory manumission of slaves and servants, and so on. Those are institutional societal requirements, not voluntarist. I'll leave it.
Yes, thank you very much for these comments, and thank you for elaborating. I wish I'd gone there. In my opinion, Moses, I think I mentioned, he wasn't, in terms of practicalities, a standout economist, but he did one thing that, in my opinion, means that Moses started economics, because he transferred lots of practices and said, the reason they're a good idea is because in the book of Genesis it says whatever it says, and therefore this is sanctioned by God's will. And when he did that, he changed economics forever. Because before, the Babylonian king or the Egyptian pharaoh or anybody else could say, I'm going to change things now. And when people would say, well, why? He said, well, because I just said so. But with Moses, it's no longer possible for the head person to say, this is the way we do things because I say so. He had to say, this is the way we do things because he says so. And by doing that, he turned ethics and economics into a separate discipline. And that's why I feel economics starts with Moses.
I'm just wondering whether you've been a bit harsh on both Greek and Roman civilization. For example, the Athenians had what were known as liturgies. Liturgy was something that you subsidized a chorus or you put a trireme. So there was a sense in which there was a sort of social obligation between different members of Athenian democracy. And also within the case of the Romans with the dole was still a sense of obligation, but it was limited to citizens, as in the case of Athens, or at least it's always limited to citizens. But I wonder if that's any different, in fact, in the Abrahamic traditions. These aren't universal doles and things that are being handed out to everybody. The Christians are renowned because they do things for Christians. The Jews are renowned because they do things for Jews. The Muslims are renowned, they didn't give a stuff about all the subject populations that they ruled over in the Middle East in the early days. It was all about Muslims. So in both cases, you've got particularity, not universality. And just going back to the case of Julian, I think the reason why Julian was so upset is because, as we know, there was a breakdown of Roman order in the 3rd century, which meant that a lot of the cities that used to do any things were no longer had the capability. People ran away from public responsibilities, which is why you get the Constantinian bureaucratic state emerging. So maybe that's a reflection not of a universal again, but of the particular circumstances that the Roman Empire entered into in the 4th century. So maybe there were census obligations. It's just that the big difference between Abrahamic and the others is that it's about poor relief, whereas it's about other things, perhaps with the Romans and the Greeks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for mentioning the liturgies. I concur especially with your, and underscore your last statement. There was philanthropy. It is a Greek word after all. Not that they were miserable old curmudgeonly people, miserly people. No, they could be generous, but poverty didn't come into it. So there were liturgies, there was income equalization, there were those policies existed, but I don't need to be repeating myself if I went on. And you mentioned the breakdown and the demands on the demand side for poverty relief in the very late antiquity. And it reminded me very much of two issues, is that probably pauperization occurs in cities rather than in villages and in the countryside. And it also reminded me of someone who's not a contemporary of Julian, but comes a little later, the Christian thinker John Chrysostomos, because he was the first who had cost-benefit analysis by saying we have X people in the city of Antioch. There are, I'm making up the numbers, 1,000 people who are very rich, 3,000 people who just get by, and 500 people who are really poor. Now, if each of the 1,000 people and with those 500, look, we could have a much better world. So I'm not completely. I thank you very much for enhancing, amplifying, and enlarging what I was saying.
Wayne.
I'm going to point that I think applies to three of the speakers, really. If you were writing these papers in 1850, you could say what you've said very well. But a little bit later, we have globalized all historical knowledges, and there are now vast amounts of material deconstructing all Western historical categories, and also showing the limited archival sources on which those knowledges were based. And my point is really supporting what Gregory was saying, because I think he's right. Because in almost each of those cases that you brought up, you didn't really investigate the origin of the practices you refer to. So if, for example, you think that German pietists were very important, well, that's good. It would be important to know why they had social concern and where they got it from. And they certainly didn't get it from German pietists. Okay? So the derivation just isn't there, and it's too localized within the ideology. If you move to the case of the Latin American material, then the problem is this term Euro-Christian, which again is entirely antique. I mean, decoloniality is a lot of fun, but it's written by people who live in Coimbra. So it's again the old imperialist problem of the empire writing back. The same thing that shot down post-colonialism shoots down decoloniality. This is the old imperial class lamenting imperialism. So you have to deconstruct Euro-Christian because, of course, in what sense were they Euro? I mean, after all, 3/4 of Europe had nothing to do with any of this. None of the Orthodox churches were involved. And the idea that Christianity is European is monstrous for all kinds of reasons. So I think you need contemporary historical scholarship, not the rhetoric of the upper class from Coimbra.
No,
Right?
I don't.
Well, you haven't read the decoloniality books by the upper class.
So I disagree on
Yeah.
the post-colonial issue because indigenous people are not post-colonial in any.
No, we agree totally on indigenous because I'm dealing with this all the time as an Australian. All the same issues apply in our country, including massive genocide. So I'm with you on the politics and the ethics, but the history is shonky. So you need to be careful of shonky history. And in the case of Benedikt, the history is certainly not shonky, but a brilliant presentation, but you left out the whole of Asia. And in the same way, you gave us what really I'd call an Abrahamic rabbit story. Now, there are hundreds of them. Asman is full of this rubbish. Where did things come from? They come from the Jews or the Abrahamic peoples. Well, lovely, but that's called a rabbit story in historiography. That means our lot did it. Well, maybe you did. But you have to test that by looking carefully at the counter-evidence. For example, the whole history of capitalism does not come from Israel, for God's sake. It comes from the Buddhist monasteries in China. And China had developed forms of mutual aid entirely independent of what you discuss. And the idea that there's some connection between mutual aid and Christian and Jewish practice needs to be looked at very closely. Because if you look at most of the extensive aid to Africa, it isn't Jewish, is it? And if you look at the way Jews are currently managing the Middle East, and Aye and I may talk about this tomorrow, it doesn't illustrate these principles. So we have to be very careful about saying it comes from us. Not because it doesn't, I'm sure it does, but the origin isn't you, because there's something fantastically wrong with saying my lot are the better rabbits and we did it. It's like saying India's better now, the British Empire was there. You know, this is absolute nonsense for 100,000 reasons.
I just had a little tiny comment, which was about, like in the Lord's Prayer, the Christian Lord's Prayer, it says like, there's a line that says, forgive us our trespasses, or another one says, as we forgive those who trespass against us. There's another version that says, forgive us our sins, blah, blah, blah. But I heard a Middle Ages version where it said, forgive us our debts. And I thought, oh, that makes the most sense of those versions. And it hasn't made it to the present day, at least not in English.
No, not in English. In the Vulgate, it's dimite nobis debita nostra. And so it is about debts, and
That really.
and it is about debts. And I didn't speak about usury, which is the subject of a different topic. But when it comes to usury and lending at interest, I'm always very careful not to put my head too far over the parapet when I'm with economists, because Moses, Jesus, and Mohammed are exactly on the same page when it comes to lending at interest. And if there were a panel discussion between them about lending and interest, it would be very hard for the moderator to get a discussion going, because they'd say exactly the same thing. Yeah. So I agree with you, but usury and lending at interest, and I didn't cover that, and you may say that as, of course, it's contiguous with issues of mutual aid. So thank you.
We just call out and have Charles Murray come in. Stir it up. More comments, questions? No?
Can I respond?
Yeah, sure.
So to speak to some of Wayne's points, certainly Christianity is not European. That's not the term Euro-Christian is just an analytic term to talk about a social movement that comes out of Europe. And to speak in terms of indigenous groups across continents, what we're really dealing with is the doctrine of discovery, which is a legal concept that comes from papal bulls in the 15th century, and that still in the United States is on the law books. Since 1823, it's been on the law books, and it's been cited up into recent years. So, and I'm not as up on law in New Zealand and Australia because I'm focusing on another project right now. But so for example, for me, the African American church is not necessarily Euro-Christian either, for example. So again, Dr. Tinker has an essay on the use of the term Euro-Christian, which I'm sort of pulling it from, so he might be the better person to go to there. But it really is just a sociological kind of analytic concept rather than an essentializing, universalizing thing about all Christians.
Any other remarks for the panel? Okay, we'll